The moment I knew my life would never be the same was when I watched myself sleeping on security footage and saw someone else in the room with me. I'm 28 years old, and I've lived alone in my one-bedroom apartment in Manchester for 3 years now. After a string of break-ins in our building last autumn, I decided to install a basic security camera system. Nothing expensive, just a simple wireless camera from Amazon that sends alerts to my phone when it detects motion. I mounted it above my front door, facing the hallway. Most of the time, it just captured me stumbling home from work at the accounting firm, or the occasional delivery driver dropping off packages for my neighbors. I'd gotten used to the soft red blinking light that indicated it was recording. It became a small comfort, actually, knowing that little electronic I was watching over my space. And if you think that's bad, you won't believe what happened next. It was a Tuesday night in February when everything started. I'd fallen asleep around 11:30, exhausted from a particularly brutal day of tax season preparations. Around 3:15 in the morning, I jolted awake from the most vivid nightmare I'd ever experienced. In the dream, someone was standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me sleep. The presence felt so real that my heart was still hammering against my ribs when I sat up. The apartment was completely silent, but something felt wrong. You know that feeling when you're certain someone's been in your space? The air felt different somehow, disturbed, like someone had just walked through it. I reached for my phone to check the time, and that's when I noticed the notification. Motion detected at 3:07 a.m. My stomach dropped. I opened the app with trembling fingers. The clip showed my front door, completely still for several seconds. Then, just as the 30-second recording was about to end, I saw it. A shadow moving across the far edge of the frame, near where I keep my shoes. It was quick, just a flicker, but it was definitely there. Something had moved in my hallway. I sat there in bed, staring at the footage, playing it over and over again. The shadow appeared for maybe 2 seconds, sliding across the wall like someone had walked past just outside the camera's full range. But that made no sense. My apartment is at the end of the corridor. There's nowhere to go beyond my door except the emergency exit, which is always locked and alarmed. I crept out of bed and pressed my ear to the front door. Nothing. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty, lit only by the dim emergency lighting. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the distant hum of the building's heating system. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night on my couch, laptop open, rewatching that clip until my eyes burned. In the harsh light of morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the shadows, maybe a neighbor's cat that had somehow gotten into the building. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day at work, I couldn't concentrate. My colleague Sarah noticed I looked exhausted and asked if I was feeling all right. I wanted to tell her about the footage, but what would I say? That I'd seen a shadow move in a 30-second video clip? She'd think I was losing my mind. That evening, I decided to test the camera. I walked up and down the hallway, waving my arms, making sure it was capturing everything properly. The footage was crystal clear. Every movement triggered an alert. Every detail was recorded perfectly. Whatever I'd seen the night before, it wasn't a malfunction. I went to bed early, hoping for a normal night's sleep. But at 2:43 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Motion detected. This time, the footage was different. The clip showed my door as usual, but about 15 seconds in, I could see something moving in the reflection of the glass panel next to my apartment number. It was subtle, just a shift in the light, but it looked like someone was standing just outside the camera's view, pressed against the wall. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep beside my bed and crept to the door. Again, I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But this time, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The emergency exit door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. That door is always closed. Always. It's connected to the building's alarm system, and if someone opens it, the whole building should be alerted. But there was no alarm. Just that door, cracked open maybe an inch with darkness beyond. I stood there for 10 minutes, bat in hand, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I called the building's emergency maintenance line. The night security guard, a kind older man named Robert, came up to check. He was just as confused as I was. "That's strange," he said, closing the door firmly. "This should have triggered the alarm. I'll have to file a report in the morning." Robert walked me back to my apartment, and I showed him the footage on my phone. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowed. "I've been working security for 15 years, he said finally. "Buildings like this, they play tricks on you sometimes. Old pipes, settling foundations, electrical issues could be affecting your camera's sensors." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. The next morning, I called the building management office. They assured me they'd send someone to check the emergency exit door and the alarm system. But when I got home from work that evening, nothing had changed. No repair tickets, no follow-up calls, no explanations. That's when I decided to set up additional cameras. I bought 2 more wireless cameras and positioned them strategically around my apartment. One in the living room aimed at the window and the front door. Another in the hallway leading to my bedroom. If someone was getting into my space, I was going to catch them. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The cameras recorded hours of empty rooms, and I started to think maybe Robert was right. Maybe it was just the building settling or some kind of technical glitch. But on Saturday night, everything changed. I was having dinner with my sister Emma at a restaurant downtown. We'd been there for about 2 hours, catching up over wine and pasta, when my phone started buzzing with alerts. "Motion detected. Motion detected. Motion detected." "Jesus, James, what's wrong?" Emma asked, seeing my face drain of color. I opened the app under the table. The first notification was from the front door camera. Someone was standing in my hallway, just outside my apartment. They were tall, wearing dark clothing, and they were perfectly still. Not moving at all, just standing there like they were waiting for something. The second alert was from the living room camera. My front door was opening. "I have to go," I said. Standing so quickly, I knocked over my wine glass. "Someone's in my apartment." Emma grabbed my arm. "James, call the police. Don't go there alone." But I was already running toward the exit. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and panic. I called 999 from the car, but the dispatcher said they'd need more than security footage to send someone out immediately. They'd file a report and have a constable come by within the hour. An hour. Someone could be destroying my entire life in an hour. I pulled up to my building with my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. The lobby was empty, the elevator working normally. Everything looked exactly as it should. But as I rode up to the 4th floor, I kept checking my phone. The cameras had gone dark 20 minutes ago. All of them. My apartment door was closed and locked. I stood there for several minutes, listening. Nothing. I turned the key as quietly as possible and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not something bad exactly, but different. Like someone had been cooking, even though I hadn't used the kitchen in days. The air was warm and slightly humid, as if someone had been breathing in my space for hours. I walked through each room with my phone's flashlight, checking every corner, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. But things were different. My coffee mug was in the sink, even though I'd left it in the dishwasher. The throw pillow on my couch was on the wrong side. The bathroom door was open, and I always keep it closed. Small things. Things that could be explained away individually, but together they painted a picture that terrified me. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had been living in my space. I spent the night at Emma's place, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in my hallway, perfectly still, waiting. The next morning, I drove back to check the cameras. They were all working perfectly, but there was no footage from the night before. The memory cards were completely blank from 6:45 p.m. onward. That's when I knew this wasn't random. Whoever was doing this knew about my security system. They knew how to disable it. They knew my schedule. They knew when I'd be home and when I wouldn't. I called in sick to work and spent the day installing new cameras. Different brand, different system, hidden in places no one would think to look. I also changed my locks and installed additional deadbolts. If someone wanted to get in, they'd have to break down the door. But I was thinking about it all wrong. The problem wasn't someone breaking in. The problem was someone who was already inside. That night, I set up in the living room with a clear view of every entrance. I had my laptop open, monitoring all the camera feeds in real time. I was going to catch this person. I was going to end this. At 1:17 a.m., I saw movement on the bedroom camera. Someone was sitting on my bed. I was 15 feet away, in the living room, watching my own bedroom on a computer screen. But there was someone sitting on my bed. They were facing away from the camera, completely still, just sitting there in the dark. I grabbed the baseball bat and crept toward the bedroom. The door was closed. I was certain I'd left it open. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made. Nothing was disturbed. But on my laptop screen, the figure was still there. Still sitting on the bed, in the exact same position. I looked back and forth between the room and the screen. The room was empty. The screen showed someone sitting on my bed. I walked closer to the camera, looking directly at it. On the screen, I could see myself standing in the doorway, but I could also see the figure on the bed behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. I looked back at the screen. The figure had turned toward the camera. I couldn't make out the face clearly, but I could see they were smiling. Then the screen went black. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked outside the building, watching my apartment windows. I called the police again, but without physical evidence, there was nothing they could do. The security footage was corrupted, they said. Probably a technical malfunction. But I knew better. The next day, I installed a new type of camera. One that uploaded footage directly to cloud storage in real time. If someone was tampering with my system, they'd have to hack into servers hundreds of miles away. That night, I got the footage I'd been waiting for. At 3:26 a.m., while I was asleep in bed, someone entered my bedroom. The infrared camera captured everything in perfect detail. They were tall, wearing dark clothing, and they moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. They walked to the side of my bed and stood there, looking down at me. For 12 minutes, they just stood there, watching me sleep. Then they reached out and touched my face. I didn't wake up. I didn't move. I just kept sleeping while this stranger caressed my cheek with their fingertips. Then they walked to my dresser and opened the top drawer. They pulled out a piece of clothing, my favorite hoodie, and put it on. They stood in front of my mirror, adjusting the hood, like they were getting ready to go out. But they didn't leave. They walked back to the bed and lay down next to me. For the next 4 hours, this person lay in my bed, inches away from me, while I slept. The camera captured everything. Every movement, every breath, every moment of this violation. And just before dawn, they got up, returned my hoodie to the drawer, and walked out of the room. I woke up that morning feeling like I'd had the best night's sleep in weeks. I felt refreshed, peaceful even. I had no memory of anything unusual happening. When I watched the footage, I vomited. Someone had been sleeping in my bed. Someone had been touching me. Someone had been wearing my clothes, breathing my air, sharing my space for hours while I was unconscious and vulnerable. I packed a bag and went to Emma's immediately. I told her everything, showed her the footage. She was horrified, but she believed me. She helped me file a proper police report, and this time they took it seriously. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. They dusted for fingerprints, checked the building's security logs, interviewed every tenant and employee. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no physical evidence, no suspects. But they did find something strange. The building's master key logs showed that someone had accessed my apartment 17 times over the past 2 months. Always between 2 and 5 a.m. Always when I was home and asleep. But the key card used belonged to a maintenance worker who'd been dead for 6 months. David Thompson had worked for the building management company for 12 years. He'd had access to every apartment, every utility room, every storage area. He died in a car accident the previous September, but somehow his key card was still active in the system. The police checked his apartment, his belongings, his history. They found nothing connecting him to me specifically, but they did find something else. Hidden in his closet were dozens of photographs, pictures of tenants sleeping, pictures of people in their apartments, unaware they were being watched, pictures of personal belongings, daily routines, private moments. I was in some of those photographs. The police theorized that Thompson had been stalking tenants for years, using his access to enter apartments while people slept. But he was dead. He couldn't be the person in my security footage. Unless someone else had his key card. The investigation went cold. The building management company changed all the locks, updated their security systems, and offered to move me to a different unit. But I couldn't stay. Even in a new apartment, I'd always wonder if someone was watching, waiting, planning their next visit. I moved out of Manchester entirely, found a new job in London, a new apartment in a building with 24-hour security. I thought I'd left it all behind. But last month, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I always keep it closed. Always. And there, on my nightstand, was a photograph. A picture of me sleeping, taken with what looked like a phone camera. Recent. In my new apartment. In my new city. On the back, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Sweet dreams, James." I called the police, but what could they do? Move again? Change my name? Live in fear for the rest of my life? Instead, I decided to tell this story. To put it out there, in case someone else has experienced something similar. In case someone knows something about David Thompson, or whoever is using his identity. Because I don't think this is over. I think someone is still watching, still waiting, still planning their next visit. And the worst part? I'm starting to think they've been doing this for much longer than I realized. Those nights when I slept so well, when I woke up feeling refreshed and peaceful, I think they were there. I think they've been visiting me for months, maybe years, and I never knew. How many times has someone stood over my bed, watching me sleep? How many times have they touched my face, worn my clothes, breathed my air? How many times have they been closer to me than I've ever been to another human being? I wish I could end the story there, but there's more. So much more that I've never told anyone. Not even Emma. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about reality, about death, and about the thin line between the two. After finding that photograph in my London apartment, I became obsessed with David Thompson. I spent weeks researching everything I could find about him. His employment records, his personal history, his death. I needed to understand who he was, why he'd chosen me, and most importantly, how he could still be terrorizing me from beyond the grave. The more I learned, the more disturbed I became. David Thompson had worked for Hartwell Property Management for 12 years, but his employment file was strangely thin. No emergency contacts, no references from previous jobs, no personal information beyond the basics. It was as if he'd materialized out of nowhere in 2011 and seamlessly integrated into the building's maintenance staff. I managed to track down his former supervisor, a woman named Margaret Chen who'd retired the previous year. When I called her, pretending to be conducting a routine insurance investigation, her voice immediately became tense. "David Thompson," she repeated slowly. "I haven't heard that name in months. Why are you asking about him?" "Just tying up some loose ends regarding his employment benefits," I lied. "Did you work closely with him?" There was a long pause. "Mr. Williams," I said, using a fake name. "Michael Williams." "Mr. Williams, I'm going to be honest with you. David Thompson was the strangest employee I've ever supervised. He was competent, never missed a day of work, never caused any problems. But there was something off about him. The other maintenance staff avoided him. Tenants would call to specifically request that someone else handle their repairs. What kind of complaints? Nothing specific, just that he made people uncomfortable. He had this way of being too quiet, too observant, like he was cataloging everything about their lives. And he always seemed to know things about the tenants that he shouldn't have known. My heart rate spiked. What kind of things? Personal details. their schedules, their habits, their relationships. Information that wouldn't be in any maintenance request. When I asked him about it, he'd just smile and say he was thorough in his work. I pressed for more details, but Margaret was clearly uncomfortable discussing her former employee. She did tell me one thing that chilled me to the bone. David Thompson had specifically requested to work the night shift, and he'd shown particular interest in apartments where young professionals lived alone. After hanging up, I sat in my London flat, staring at the photograph on my nightstand. David Thompson had been dead for 8 months. So who had taken this picture? Who had been in my apartment? Who had written those words in such eerily familiar handwriting? I decided to visit his grave. Hampstead Cemetery is a sprawling, overgrown place where London's dead have been buried for over a century. David Thompson's grave was in the newer section, marked by a simple headstone that read only his name and dates. No epitaph, no beloved son or devoted friend, just the bare facts of his existence. I stood there for an hour hoping to feel some kind of closure or understanding. Instead, I felt watched. It was the same sensation I'd experienced in my Manchester apartment, that prickly awareness that someone was observing me from the shadows. As I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh flowers had been placed on the grave. Not old, wilted flowers that might have been there for weeks, but fresh white roses that couldn't have been there for more than a day or two. Who was bringing flowers to David Thompson's grave? Who was mourning this man who'd spent his life violating other people's privacy and safety? I approached the cemetery groundskeeper, an elderly man named Albert who'd worked there for 30 years. When I described the grave and asked about recent visitors, his expression darkened. "That's a strange coincidence," he said. "You're the second person to ask about David Thompson this week. Someone else was here? Yesterday morning. A young woman about your age. She seemed very interested in the grave, spent quite a bit of time there. But when I approached her, she hurried away without saying anything." A young woman. My mind raced through possibilities. A girlfriend? A relative? Or someone else who'd been terrorized by David Thompson and was seeking the same answers I was. I left my contact information with Albert and asked him to call me if anyone else visited the grave. Then I drove back to London, my mind churning with new questions and darker possibilities. That night, I set up my cameras again. I'd been lax about security since moving to London, convinced that distance and new locks would keep me safe. But the photograph proved that nowhere was safe. If someone could find me in a new city, in a new building, then they could find me anywhere. At 2:47 a.m., I got the alert I'd been dreading. Motion detected. The footage showed my front door, but this time the person standing in the hallway wasn't hiding. They were looking directly at the camera, as if they wanted to be seen. They were wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring their face, but I could see they were holding something in their hands. A key. They inserted it into my lock and turned it slowly. The door opened without resistance. I was watching this happen in real time from my bedroom, my phone clutched in my trembling hands. I should have called the police immediately, should have grabbed a weapon, should have done something. Instead, I just watched, paralyzed by fear and morbid curiosity. The figure entered my apartment and closed the door behind them. They moved through my living room with the confidence of someone who knew the layout perfectly. They didn't turn on any lights, didn't stumble over furniture, didn't hesitate at any point. They walked straight to my bedroom. I held my breath as the door handle turned. The figure stepped into my room and stood at the foot of my bed, looking down at me. I was pretending to sleep, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was certain they could hear it. For several minutes, they just stood there. Then they reached up and pulled back their hood. It was a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and pale skin. She was beautiful in an unsettling way, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to reflect the dim light from my phone screen. I'd never seen her before in my life. She smiled down at me, the same smile I'd seen in the security footage from my Manchester apartment. But this wasn't David Thompson. This was someone else entirely. She walked to my dresser and, just like in the previous footage, opened the top drawer. She pulled out a piece of clothing, a t-shirt this time, and held it to her face, breathing in deeply. Then she put it on, even though it was far too large for her frame. She returned to the bed and lay down next to me. For the next 3 hours, she lay there, sometimes watching me sleep, sometimes just staring at the ceiling. Occasionally, she would reach out and touch my arm or my face, gentle caresses that felt disturbingly intimate. Just before dawn, she got up, returned my shirt to the drawer, and walked out of the room. I heard the front door close, and then she was gone. I waited until I was certain she'd left, then immediately called the police. This time, I had clear footage of someone breaking into my apartment. This time, they couldn't dismiss it as a technical malfunction or a case of mistaken identity. The responding officers were professional and thorough. They dusted for fingerprints, examined the locks, reviewed the security footage. But they found nothing. No prints, no hair fibers, no DNA evidence. It was as if the woman had never been there at all. The lock showed no signs of tampering, and the key she'd used left no scratches or marks. When they tested it, my door opened normally with my own key, but remained securely locked against any attempts to pick or force it. "This is highly unusual," said Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator. "The footage clearly shows someone entering your apartment, but there's no physical evidence of their presence. It's almost as if..." "As if what?" She hesitated. "As if they were never really here at all." But I knew they were wrong. I could still smell her perfume on my pillow, still feel the warmth from where she'd lain beside me. She'd been there. She'd been real. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with identifying the woman. I spent hours studying the security footage, trying to capture clear images of her face. I searched missing persons databases, social media, anything that might give me a clue about who she was. Then I remembered the woman who'd visited David Thompson's grave. I called Albert, the cemetery groundskeeper, and asked him to describe the visitor in detail. His description matched the woman in my security footage perfectly. Same age, same build, same long dark hair. "There's something else," Albert said. "After you left yesterday, I did some checking in our records. David Thompson's grave isn't actually paid for by family. It's maintained by a trust fund that was set up specifically for that purpose." "What kind of trust fund?" "The paperwork is from a law firm in Manchester, Ashworth, Bentley and Associates. They've been paying for the grave maintenance since Thompson's death. But they won't say who established the trust or why." I called the law firm immediately. After being transferred through several departments, I finally reached someone who could discuss the Thompson Trust, though they were limited in what they could reveal due to client confidentiality. "I can confirm that a trust was established for the maintenance of David Thompson's grave," said the lawyer, a woman named Victoria Ashworth. "But I cannot disclose the identity of the trust's beneficiary without proper legal authorization. Can you at least tell me if the beneficiary is a young woman with dark hair?" There was a long pause. "I think you should come to Manchester, Mr. Williams. There are some things about David Thompson's situation that might be relevant to your inquiry." The next morning, I took the train to Manchester. The law offices of Ashworth, Bentley and Associates occupied the top floor of a Victorian building in the city center. Victoria Ashworth was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, but she looked troubled as she reviewed the file on her desk. "Mr. Williams," she began, "I'm going to tell you something that violates every principle of client confidentiality, but I believe it's necessary for your safety." She opened the file and pulled out a photograph. It was the same woman from my security footage, but this picture was older, maybe from several years ago. She was smiling, but there was something hollow in her eyes. "This is Rebecca Thompson," Victoria said. "David's daughter." His daughter? But his employment records showed no family. David Thompson was a very private man, and he had reasons to keep his personal life separate from his professional one. Rebecca has been troubled for most of her adult life. She's been in and out of psychiatric facilities since she was 18. "What kind of troubles?" Victoria hesitated. "Obsessive behavior, stalking, identity theft. She has a condition called erotomania. She becomes fixated on individuals and believes they're in love with her, even when they've never met." My heart sank. Everything was starting to make sense. After David's death, Rebecca became convinced that he'd been murdered. She believed that the tenants in his building were somehow responsible. She's been acting out her grief in increasingly dangerous ways. You mean she's been continuing his work? We believe so. She inherited his personal effects, including his keys and security codes. She's been using them to access the apartments where he used to conduct his activities. I felt sick. How long has this been going on? Since shortly after his death. We've been trying to help her, to get her the treatment she needs, but she's very clever. She knows how to avoid being caught, how to cover her tracks. Why didn't you contact the police? We tried, but Rebecca is skilled at manipulating the system. She's never actually harmed anyone, never taken anything of value. From a legal standpoint, she's technically trespassing, but proving it has been nearly impossible. I thought about all those nights when I'd slept so peacefully, all those mornings when I'd woken up feeling refreshed and content. Rebecca had been there, watching me, touching me, sharing my space. The idea made my skin crawl. There's something else, Victoria continued. Rebecca has been keeping detailed records of her activities. Photographs, videos, personal observations. She's created an entire fantasy world around the people she's been stalking. You mean she has records of me? Extensive records. She's been documenting your life for months, maybe longer. She knows your schedule, your habits, your preferences. She's convinced herself that you're connected to her father's death. I left the law office with Rebecca's last known address and a promise from Victoria that she'd contact the authorities immediately. But as I drove through Manchester's rainy streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Rebecca Thompson lived in a council flat in a rundown area of the city. The building was old and poorly maintained, with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. I parked across the street and called Detective Inspector Mitchell in London, explaining what I'd learned. We'll coordinate with Manchester Police, she said. But you need to stay away from there. If this woman is as unstable as you're suggesting, confronting her could be dangerous. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to understand why she'd chosen me, why she'd continued her father's twisted legacy. I needed to see where she lived, what kind of life she'd built around her obsession. The building's front door was propped open with a brick. I slipped inside and climbed the stairs to the third floor. Rebecca's flat was at the end of a dimly lit corridor. I could hear music playing softly from inside. I knocked on the door. The music stopped. Rebecca, I called out. I know you're in there. I know about your father. I know what you've been doing. The door opened slowly. Rebecca stood in the doorway wearing my Manchester United t-shirt, the one I'd been looking for before I moved to London. She looked exactly as she had in the security footage, but up close, I could see the dark circles under her eyes, the unhealthy pallor of her skin. You came, she said, smiling. I knew you would. I've been waiting for you. Rebecca, you need help. What you've been doing. I've been taking care of you, she interrupted. Just like my father did. He taught me how to watch over people, how to keep them safe while they sleep. Your father was a stalker. He violated people's privacy. He was sick. Her expression darkened. Don't you dare speak about him that way. He was protecting people. He was making sure they weren't alone. She stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. Against my better judgment, I followed her into the flat. The space was small and cramped, but every surface was covered with photographs. Pictures of me sleeping, eating, working, walking down the street. Pictures of other people too. Dozens of faces I didn't recognize, all captured in private moments. But it was the far wall that made my blood run cold. It was covered with newspaper clippings, police reports, and what looked like surveillance photos. All related to David Thompson's death. You've been investigating his accident? It wasn't an accident, Rebecca said, her voice becoming sharp. Someone killed him. Someone who knew about his work, who wanted to stop him from protecting people. I studied the wall more closely. The accident report was straightforward. David Thompson had been driving home from work when he'd lost control of his car on a wet road. He'd struck a tree and died instantly. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication that anyone else had been involved. Rebecca, Your father's death was an accident. The police investigated. The police don't understand, she shouted. They don't see the patterns. They don't know what my father knew. She pulled out a thick folder and opened it on a small table. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. It was a comprehensive record of her father's activities, but also something more. My father discovered something, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He found out that someone was watching him, someone who knew about his work with the tenants. I flipped through the pages. David Thompson had been paranoid in his final months, convinced that someone was following him, monitoring his activities. He documented strange phone calls, mysterious packages, people who seemed to be observing him at work. He was scared, Rebecca continued. For the first time in his life, my father was afraid. And then he died. Looking at the evidence she'd collected, I had to admit there were some strange coincidences. David Thompson's death had occurred just days after he'd filed a complaint with building management about unauthorized access to the master key system. Someone had been using keycards to enter apartments without permission. But that doesn't mean he was murdered, I said carefully. It could have been a coincidence. There are no coincidences, Rebecca said firmly. My father taught me that. Everything is connected. Every event has a purpose. She showed me more documents. Financial records indicating that David Thompson had been planning to leave Manchester. A letter of resignation that had never been submitted. Receipts for a storage unit where he'd apparently been keeping important materials. He was going to disappear, Rebecca said. He'd found out something that put him in danger, and he was going to leave everything behind. But they killed him before he could escape. I wanted to dismiss her theories as the delusions of a grief-stricken daughter, but the evidence was more compelling than I'd expected. David Thompson had been acting strangely in his final weeks, taking unusual precautions, making preparations that suggested he felt threatened. Even if that's true, I said, what does any of this have to do with me? Why have you been stalking me? Rebecca's expression softened. Because you're connected to him. You lived in his building, you were one of his projects. If someone killed him to stop his work, then you might be in danger too. That's insane. Is it? You've been experiencing strange incidents, haven't you? Break-ins, security camera malfunctions, the feeling that someone's watching you. What if those aren't random events? What if someone is targeting you because of your connection to my father? I thought about the shadow in my hallway, the figure in my bedroom, the way my security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned. I'd assumed it was all connected to David Thompson's posthumous activities. But what if Rebecca was right? What if someone else was involved? I've been protecting you, she continued, just like my father would have wanted. I've been watching over you, making sure you're safe while you sleep. You've been breaking into my apartments and lying in my bed. That's not protection, that's assault. I would never hurt you, she said, looking genuinely confused. I care about you. I've been taking care of you. I realized that Rebecca wasn't just mentally ill. She was living in a completely different reality. In her mind, she was the hero of the story, carrying on her father's work and protecting innocent people from some unknown threat. Rebecca, I need you to stop. I need you to stay away from me and get help. Her face crumpled. You don't understand. If I stop watching over you, something terrible will happen. I can feel it. Nothing will happen. I'll be fine. No, she said, becoming agitated. You don't know what's out there. You don't know who killed my father or why. You need me. I backed toward the door, but she grabbed my arm. Please don't leave, she begged. I can show you everything. I can prove that my father was murdered. I can prove that you're in danger. I have to go, Rebecca. The police are coming. They're going to help you. The police don't believe me. They think I'm crazy. But I'm not crazy. I'm the only one who knows the truth. I gently pulled free from her grip and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, she called out one more time. James, be careful. They're still watching you. They're still out there. I left the building and drove straight to the Manchester police station. Within an hour, officers had gone to Rebecca's flat to arrest her. But when they arrived, she was gone. The apartment was empty except for the photographs and documents, which they collected as evidence. Rebecca Thompson had vanished, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. I returned to London hoping that would be the end of it. The police assured me that they'd continue looking for Rebecca, that she'd be found and given the help she needed. I changed my locks again, installed additional security measures, and tried to resume my normal life. But Rebecca's words haunted me. They're still watching you. They're still out there. What if she'd been right? What if David Thompson's death hadn't been an accident? What if someone had killed him and now they were coming for me? 3 weeks later, I woke up to find another photograph on my nightstand. This one showed me walking to work, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. On the back, in different handwriting than before, someone had written, "Rebecca was right. You should have listened to her." This story was completely true, except for all the parts that weren't. Thanks for listening. That's how it happened or didn't. But if it did, don't think it couldn't happen to you. Subscribe to It Happened to Me. A new story drops daily.